Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our Small Majority. I'm your host, Christian Black,
And I'm your co-host, Matthew Goryachkovsky.
and today we have Keramet Reiter. Keramet, it is so good to hear you again.
It's a pleasure to talk with you both. I'm excited about this podcast.
Okay, so today we're just going to be talking about prison policy in the United States. And I know that you have so much experience, not only inside prison policy, but prison rights and solitary confinement, both here in the States and internationally. But before we get inside the nitty gritty, I wanted to ask you, how did you even get involved inside, work inside of prisons? And how did you transition over to prison rights and focusing primarily in solitary confinement?
So I first got interested in prison issues in college. I just volunteered in a prison education program, actually, and I I was interested in teaching, and I had some friends who were doing it, and that sounded like an unusual opportunity. And I just through that work became more and more interested in what was happening in our prisons. So I worked first in a juvenile detention center, and then in an adult jail facility in Boston. And I just kept meeting people who had really interesting stories. Who had faced a lot of trauma and were really impressive students who were trying to overcome those experiences. And as I stuck with it, I kind of came to see, even once they were ready to get an education, the challenges people faced. And so that kind of work kept me really interested in prison issues. And when I finished college, I was looking for advocacy jobs that would give me a chance to kind of learn more about prison issues and continue to do that work more full time. And the story I often tell is that I did advocacy work for a few years. I worked as a paralegal, doing basically investigations for class action legal cases around prison conditions. And then I worked for Human Rights Watch doing policy work around prison issues in the US. And I kept being surprised at how little we knew about our prisons. So I ended up in situations again and again where we didn't even know what we needed to know to make good policy recommendations or to make good strategic legal decisions. So I often talk about working for Human Rights Watch and when the death penalty for kids was declared unconstitutional in the United States. And
Mhm.
we did the work to figure out at that point how many kids had been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, because there was no count of that in the United States at that time. And it turned out there were hundreds. And it turned out lots of them had been sentenced for non-murder crimes. So
Mm.
that just those kinds of little pieces of information seemed like they'd be so obvious, that weren't available, then gave people a lot of ideas to work with advocacy, right? So a lot of the early advocacy around life without parole for kids was around non-homicide cases, right? Because that's an easy place where we can say, oh, does it make sense to have the worst possible sentence for the what's not even the worst possible crime we can imagine? So I was doing this advocacy work, and I got more and more interested in how I could be more kind of fundamentally involved in research work to think about these issues and to develop a better set of resources to understand what does and doesn't work in our prisons. And from that perspective, then solitary confinement was a place I obviously gravitated towards, because when I started my PhD, um, almost 20 years ago now, uh, there was very little known about solitary confinement. And so as someone who was interested in prison conditions, the ways prisoners can be mistreated, solitary confinement was a kind of an obvious place for me to study, as someone who thought, there were lots of places where we didn't know enough. That was a place where we kind of knew the least at the time.
Mhm.
So,
Wow.
would you say solitary confinement is a viable form of punishment, or do you think it should be completely abolished?
It's a complicated question. It's certainly viable. We've been using it for a long time.
Mhm.
I think the question is it it, can it be I guess the kind of fundamental question, can it be reformed, or do we just have to get rid of it completely? And my answer, there's a very robust, as of the last few years, nationwide campaign called Stop Solitary, and the goal is to abolish it. Certainly, abolish it in any form for any extended period. So, there's some acknowledgement that maybe for a few days or even a few weeks at a time it might be necessary. But the national movement and the international consensus is really around eliminating it in more extensive forms of more than a month. So, I think there is a growing consensus that that's a possibility and an important goal. And I would say that's because it's really expensive. There's not very much evidence that it helps with safety or recidivism. There's a growing body of evidence that it is really bad for mental health and potentially even for physical health, and that the combination of the dangers it causes and the lack of evidence of the benefits, I think, are suggests that it's a troubling practice whose time has come. On the other hand, I think thinking about solitary confinement in isolation, ironically, isn't necessarily that functional because it is an integral part of our prison system. Solitary confinement has existed since the first prisons were built in the United States in the early republic, and it has persisted in spite of periods of attempts to reform it over hundreds of years. And so I think, on the one hand, it seems like a really troubling practice, and there's growing evidence that it doesn't work. And on the other, I think we have to, if we think about getting rid of it, we have to think about the fact that it's so integral to our prison systems, and what does it mean to get rid of it? Because we've tried many times in the past, and so I think it's a time to step back and say, okay, well, can we learn from the problems of solitary confinement about reforms that are not just about solitary but about the entire prison system, and ways to think about alternatives not just to solitary but to incarceration.
Mhm. So, well, just to get some more historical knowledge on solitary confinement and then even some factual knowledge on solitary confinement
Hmm.
today, um, you said that solitary confinement has always been with us and it's always
Hmm.
been a practice that's been utilized inside of our prisons. How has that sort of transformed or transitioned in the introduction of like privatized prisons, and then like what does it look like for state prisons and then for
Hmm.
federal prisons?
Hmm.
How is it really used inside
Hmm.
different prisons, even from like state to state, or
Hmm.
you can even push towards like county to county too?
Hmm. It's a great question, and it's one of the problems, right? It's this gets at the heart of why it often feels like we know so little and so few practical details about the prison system in the United States, is that there's such variety. So one way to think of the prison system is 51 different systems. We have we have 50 state systems, and we have the federal system. But then, as you mentioned, Christian, we also have all of the county systems, and so that's hundreds more, and each of those are kind of like their own little jurisdictions or even kingdoms, right? That are run with their own rules and their own terminology. And that means their own policies around solitary confinement. And so it's part of why it's hard to know. One of the challenges is, different jurisdictions call it different things, and people get sent there for different reasons. In some places, you can only be sent there if you break a really serious prison rule, like you participate in a riot or you have a weapon that you're hiding. In some places, you can get sent to solitary confinement if you literally have the wrong tattoo or are reading the wrong thing. So you can get sent there if you're labeled a gang member based on circumstantial evidence like that, and you can be sent there indefinitely. And um, even within those, so you think about, okay, we've got these 51 systems, the state and the federal, we've got these proliferation of counties and city jail systems, and then we have public and private, and we have immigration detention. And I used to say, solitary confinement is so expensive that it tends not to be something that's that common in private prisons, because, generally the most secure prisons in a state, even where there's a lot of privatization, tend to be run by the state, and the kinds of contracts that private facilities are bidding on tend to be more medium security or lower security prisons that are less expensive to operate, and less risky. That said, and within the state prison system, privatization is only about 10% or less of prison facilities. But that's really changing now around immigration detention, which has a lot of overlap, of course, with incarceration and prison. And now there is an increasing use of solitary confinement in immigration detention. And I actually have an article with some colleagues who are experts in immigration, looking at the parallels, that it looks solitary confinement in immigration detention looks shockingly like solitary confinement in prisons. People are
Wow.
often sent there for really bureaucratic reasons, like potentially because they're mentally ill, potentially because they're vulnerable, sometimes because they've been labeled as gang members. It has a disparate racial impact on African Americans, especially in immigration detention, just like it has in state prisons. And so and the important thing about immigration detention is that many more of those facilities are privatized. So well, around half or more of immigration detention facilities are run by private prison companies. So there we do, it looks like, have more solitary confinement in private facilities now too. So it is in some ways, disturbingly, in spite of all the reforms, it feels like it's a practice that's expanding in all these little pockets as we learn more about them.
Hmm. Wow.
Wow. That's so do these private prisons make a profit off of them? I know some prisons force their prisoners into labor and pay
Mm.
them like severely low wages, if any at all.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, what kind of is it? Do you think it's ethical for prisons to be private in that way?
I think there are many troubling incentives with privatizing prisons. I think the idea that a private company would be invested in profiting off of incarceration creates in our in our capitalist system creates all kinds of trouble, and it's not just theoretical trouble, it's practical trouble. So the major private prison providers in the United States have also been really active lobbying for more and longer sentences and more beds allocated in immigration detention, right? So there's good evidence that they have a financial um, investment and potential gain from more people being in prison or immigration detention for longer periods of time, and that they have worked really hard to lobby politicians to ensure that that's true, that they have guaranteed bed space and guaranteed lengths of incarceration. And that's not, I don't think, whatever you think about whether private corporations can do things better than the government, it's very troubling to think about our criminal justice policy and people's freedom being driven by profit motives rather than by whether that person broke a law or not. So
Hmm.
I think that's my fundamental problem with private prisons is the way they operate in the political infrastructure we have in the United States.
Hmm. So, well, moving on to that, oh, that unpacks a lot. So, well, once you go on from that, okay. So, I just actually recently read, I think it was just a newspaper report or a newspaper article on the COVID-19 numbers inside of prisons and how they're dealing with that.
Mm,
And I believe what I read was that they were using solitary confinement as a solution or short-term
mm,
solution
mm-hmm,
for inmates that were exposed to COVID-19 or infected by COVID-19 in order to segregate healthy inmates.
mm,
However, I feel like that was a little counterproductive
mm,
because if you do that and you put them under solitary confinement they um, after they haven't done anything wrong besides being sick, because of the mental strain that it goes on and what you mentioned earlier, the
mm,
physical strain as well, that can
mm,
just make their health worse. And on the other hand, too, when it comes to the healthy inmates, not only are they worried about, do I have it now? Will it kick in the next, 2 to 3 weeks? But I hear that they're not giving the proper tools in order to practice a healthy lifestyle, in order to
absolutely.
practice proper hygiene. So, what's your take on that, and yeah, what do you make of it?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up COVID-19 because I think and its impact in prisons, because I think it's one of those things that there've been some decent headlines about, especially in areas where there've been prison-based outbreaks, but I think it's absolutely central. I think the way prisons respond to a major infectious disease outbreak is absolutely central to our national response to the pandemic, and I think there's not an adequate sense of that. And to tie it to solitary confinement, I think that it's part of why I think we're seeing playing out exactly what I was afraid of or what I am afraid of when I hear people talk about abolishing solitary confinement is that it is the tool of last resort for every problem in the prison system. And so, as long as you have problems, you're going to revert to it. And here we have a crisis of an infectious disease raging through our prisons. And of course, the first tool that prison officials go to, as always, because it's it's the only one they have in crisis situations, is solitary confinement, both to try to, as the
Mhm.
only means they have to separate people in facilities that are overcrowded and understaffed, and also as a potential way to segregate people who might be ill and they want to try to keep from interacting with other people. And exactly as you said, Christian, there are so many problems with this. I would say they basically fall into two categories. One is that, as we know, solitary confinement itself is a health concern. It can create and exacerbate mental health problems, and I have a piece documenting all the ways it can create and exacerbate physical health problems. And so it doesn't seem like a safe place to put someone facing a serious illness. But the other big problem with solitary confinement is the impact it has on a prison population if the prisoners know their response to them being ill is that they're going to be placed in these highly restrictive conditions of confinement. They then hide that they don't feel well as long as they can. And that's anecdotes I've been hearing from folks across the country, is that prisoners are afraid to say they're sick because they're going to be sent to solitary confinement, and that's really scary. They won't have any contact with anyone. They're afraid they won't be able to get treatment if they need it, and so they're
Mhm.
hiding they're sick. And of course, that's the last thing we want in a
Right.
pandemic with a highly infectious disease like this. We want to be able to know as soon as people feel sick and try to treat them. And so the best recommendations around this that I've seen are that, quarantine, of course, is absolutely vital, but people can be quarantined without being put in solitary confinement. So you can
Mhm.
create housing units in a prison where everyone is positive, and they're allowed certain movement, right? They're allowed to access phones. They're allowed to talk to each other. They know they can easily get the attention of an officer if they need medical care. And so that's the best recommendation, is that rather than putting people in conditions that feel punitive, even if they're not meant to be, do everything you can to put them in conditions that quarantine them or segregate them, but that don't impose extra harsh conditions or restrictions, because not only is it potentially bad for their health, but you run this risk of discouraging them from admitting they're sick in the first place. And that's really troubling if you're trying to contain this.
Right. Well, okay, well, to expand more on that, I know that what you just said was that it can sort of act as a reflection of what's going on inside the prisons, on
Hmm.
what's going on a national level too.
Hmm.
And that
Hmm.
sort of it sort of struck a bell with me for a quote that I heard from Angela Davis. And basically just putting it in summation, what she said was that in any given society, you can look at their prison system, and that can be a
Hmm.
clear reflection of
Hmm.
how that society functions on the outside as well.
Hmm.
So, when you look at how we're handling COVID-19 as a
Hmm.
nation compared to other nations,
Hmm.
and how we're treating our inmates and compared to how we're treating our citizens too,
Hmm.
what are some parallel patterns that you see, whether it's something related to the current civil unrest that's happening, or why certain racial ethnic groups are more vulnerable to COVID
Hmm.
19 rather
Hmm.
than people who are classified as higher socioeconomic statuses?
Hmm.
And how does that sort of relate to what's going on inside the prisons
Yep.
here?
It's a great question. And on the one hand, I could talk about it for hours. And on the other, I think I saw one statistic recently that struck me for the power of the simplicity. And that was that I think it's that the United States has about a quarter of the world's cases of COVID-19, if that sounds right, even
Yep.
though we have nowhere near that proportion of the world's population. And I was so struck when I saw that statistic, because that's roughly true of our prison population also, right? Our prison population relative to our share of the world population is so disproportionate.
That's
And
correct.
it, to me, that parallel, it's not just a coincidence, right? It speaks to the way we as a society kind of think we can put a prison away in a hidden rural area and lock the key and send people for a long time, and it's this self-contained space that's outside of our society we don't have to think about. And I think this pandemic is really showing that prisons can't be removed from society like that, no matter how long people are spending in there and no matter how rural those facilities are. When you have a pandemic a society is dealing with like this, they are in fact central to managing our response. Because one, as enclosed spaces, if someone brings it in, like a staff member or a visitor or someone from the community, then it's going to spread much more quickly, just as it is in a nursing home, right? There's real parallels there. And you have people with real vulnerabilities in our prisons too. They tend to be less healthy. Increasingly, we have elderly prisoners, so a lot of the same vulnerabilities you'd see in a nursing home. And at the same time, I think the other thing people forget is that staff leave those facilities every night and go home. And so, to the extent there is an outbreak, it's coming right back out into our communities because some people are coming and going every day. And I think people are just starting to grasp this, that prisons are, they're porous, and they're part of the challenge that we as a society are dealing with. And to the extent, I mean, just as you suggested, Christian, to the extent we have failed in terms of providing healthcare, and especially providing equitable healthcare and widespread available healthcare, that problem is just exponentially exasperated in our prisons. And we're seeing the consequences of that now. I think I wish I thought that what we've seen at San Quentin, if you followed that, was going to be an isolated story, but I'm afraid it's going to be repeated at every prison in California, and it's
Hmm.
certainly being
Hmm.
repeated in prisons in different states across the state. And that's a story of what people describe as just a bad administrative decision of being overwhelmed and transferring 100 prisoners from a place where there was an outbreak into San Quentin. Turned out they were all infected, and all of a sudden you've got thousands of prisoners who are COVID positive. They've got tent hospitals set up in the prison yard now, and they've got prisoners in ICUs all over Northern California that are filling them up because they
Hmm.
can't manage them in the prison, and they've had such a horrible outbreak. And that's really scary. Like I said, it is not contained in our prison, and I think we're just seeing the beginning of that. The silver lining is that people will start to see, our prisons are, the flip side is our prisons are a critical tool in thinking about public health, right? We
Right.
need to understand how to provide
Absolutely.
healthcare, how to make sure not just prisoners but staff have the education they need to control something like this, not to mention all the other health issues, and the resources to treat and manage.
Right. Right. I definitely agree.
Has
Now,
there?
go ahead. Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Has there been any protesting in the prisons about their treatment during COVID?
Absolutely. There has been a, an immense amount, I think, of protesting inside and advocacy outside. I mean, I think inside, it's always, our prisons are always opaque. There's always limitations on, it's really expensive for prisoners to make phone calls out. That system is privatized, and letters are really slow and censored. And so, even in the best of times, and the media is often prohibited from going in. So in the best of times, getting good information out of our prisons is really hard and slow. And right now, it's nearly impossible. A lot of prison facilities aren't even allowing phone calls. I don't know of
Well,
any in the US that are allowing visits right now of any kind. There's very little programming. So usually prisoners, at least in lower security facilities, might be going to school or going to drug treatment or counseling, and none of that is happening. And so there's just, communication is shut down. And so it's hard to know exactly how much protest is happening inside prison, but to the extent communication is coming out, I think prisoners are really scared, and they're
Hmm.
a lot of the advocacy work has centered around trying to maximize the number of people who are released. So releasing people who have less serious crimes, releasing people who have serious medical vulnerabilities, releasing people who are older, releasing people who have very little time left on their sentence. So there's all these categories of folks that there's a lot of advocacy around releasing, and there have been releases. California is planning 8,000 more releases in the next few months from state prisons, and there have been a lot of states that have been working to do that. But I hate to be the cynic, but we have to keep that in perspective. There's more than 130,000 people in prison in California, and so 8,000 is something, but it's not enough to reduce a prison system that regularly functions at 130% of capacity, right? It doesn't even
Hmm.
get the system down to capacity. Um, so yes, there's a lot of internal organizing and external advocacy support, and I think some really slow political movement. But the slowness of the movement scares me, and frankly, the focus on releases, while obviously absolutely vital and an important step to protect individual lives and potentially institutions, um, I would like to see more focus on making sure that the people who are never going to be released and the staff working in those facilities are getting the care they need, right? And so, I'm worried they're not getting protective equipment just the way hospitals have shortages. I think it's much worse in prisons. And even when they do, often there's a lot of resistance to wearing it and using it. And I think, figuring out how to get education and oversight in to ensure that people are doing what they can to mitigate the spread and the impact for those people who are stuck in the facilities is really important too.
Wasn't Paul Manafort released from a federal prison recently because
Mhm.
of COVID? I know there's a
Yes.
whole controversy about that and how like they're talking about how COVID's bad, so they have to release some prisoners, but at the same time they're trying to force kids back into schools during COVID, right?
Right.
So
Right. I mean, and we're opening bars, but not yeah. There's
yeah,
there's
it's
things
crazy. Everything's like
policy choices
contradicting
that
itself. It's
as
like
as the mother of a young child in particular, I find baffling. But
Right.
yeah, yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
yeah.
Well, I think another question for you is, since do you feel like that this whole pandemic can actually be used as an opportunity in order to educate people, like for example, to re-examine crime in general and sort of balance out like what we see in other countries or other
Mhm.
nations,
Mhm.
rather than focusing on punishment too much, but also look at it as a public health issue. So
Mhm.
like for example, when it comes to drug abuse and how we treat drugs and criminalize certain
Mhm.
drugs, and just the mass amount of sentences that we have and how long the sentences are.
Mhm.
um, I feel like that it is a good opportunity in order to sort of not necessarily reform it, because I personally am torn between abolishment and reform.
Mhm. 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 Mhm.
Because I feel like that it's the prison system should be abolished, but we can't just remove it because now our infrastructure is depending on it.
Right.
And like now our economic system is depending
Right.
on it. And then now we have all these businesses and stuff that are invested in
Right.
it.
Right. I mean, it's the
And
same with policing, right? I mean, the parallels
right,
aren't drawn enough. Yeah.
right. So what's your take on that? Do you think that because of this pandemic, that there will be certain like policies that change for the betterment of how prisons are ran?
I hope so. I'm I have my I think I imagine this is a common experience. I have my dark days and my hopeful days in the pandemic, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I think we're in the early stages, and it's hard to know both how successful we'll be at controlling the public health problem in or out of prisons and how soon in terms of a vaccine and testing and tracing. And then beyond that, it's really hard to know what the long-term economic consequences will be, right? And so on my dark days, I just get lost thinking about like how much longer we might be in this situation and how many more pressing social problems so many people are going to be facing day to day in terms of like, can they put food on the table and are their kids safe? But on my less dark days, I think um the pandemic has laid bare a lot in American society that's very uncomfortable and dysfunctional. And I think you can't separate the response to George Floyd from the pandemic, right? I think it was it was partly a culmination of growing awareness of abusive police practices, but it was partly also, to me, a culmination of growing awareness of disparate public health access in a way that I think a lot of Americans hadn't been conscious of or as convinced of before. And it was partly that intersection that was so powerful. And so I'm hopeful that the same is true of prisons, right? Just as you said, Christian, that increasingly over my career, I've gravitated more and more to public health frameworks as some of the most helpful ways to think about both what's wrong with mass incarceration and how we can intervene to improve it. Because um, I think of public health as being fairly apolitical, right? Like it's easy with the criminal justice system to get bogged down in moral debates about what we should as a society do to a murderer or a rapist or
Hmm.
someone we're scared of. And with public health, I think it's a much more institutional question about, well, what as a society is going to keep us healthiest, because
Right.
that's a social value. And I think you know, whatever you think about the individual cases with mass incarceration, the fact is it has created a massive public health problem in our country, right? And I think people are just beginning to think of it. And I don't just mean that, you know, the pandemic is raging in prisons and the outbreaks there are some of the worst. I mean that people I mean that there's all kinds of infectious diseases that are much higher rates in prison, and that people in our society who have spent time in prison face all kinds of stigma, all kinds of worse mental and physical health outcomes over the course of their lives. That creates all kinds of social costs and expenses. And there aren't, again, just as with solitary confinement, there isn't a lot of good documentation of the benefits we're getting from all of those financial and social costs, right?
Hmm.
And so I think really reframing it as a public health issue of, not only do we have health challenges that are contributing to people being incarcerated, but incarceration itself is creating all kinds of intractable health challenges in our country that are expensive both financially and socially. And thinking about addressing them from a perspective of epidemiology and understanding how we mitigate that is I think perhaps one of the most productive things we could do. And I'll say, you know, I think the focus is often on prisoners and their health risks and you know, that lead them to prison, and the health risks associated with incarceration. But
Hmm.
so many of those problems are parallel for prison staff also, right? There's huge health risks associated with working in a prison, and not just the physical health risks of being in unsafe environments, but also the psychological health risks that, you know, people who work in prison are more likely to commit suicide and more likely to be involved in domestic violence, and more likely to have all kinds of stress related health problems. And that too, right, is a public health problem that needs to be addressed.
Um, wow, that unpacks a lot. Well, all right, say that. So just level with me for a bit. Say that we do abolish, solitary confinement, the current prison system that we have, everything, right? And we start from scratch. What would be the ideal sort of fundamental things that we have to say, okay, we need to remove this, we need to remove that, and we need to change this? Like, just if you could give like your top four things, whether it's inside of the prison system itself or when it comes to our judicial system as a whole.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. I mean, and that's why it's so hard to think about abolition, right? Because it's so complicated. You've got a judicial system, you've got a prison system, you've got people whose livelihoods depend on working in these systems. And I think the other reason it's hard to think about abolition is that it's imagining an alternative that we have no idea if it would work or not, and we haven't even, right? It's sort of like we're Da Vinci imagining the first flying machine, right? um, like it's thinking outside the box in a totally new way with a lot of unknowns. And so that's, you know, I sort of preface it with that challenge. And on the other hand, I think this, to the extent this is an exciting moment, it is partly because I think people are desperate enough to think more outside of the box. And so, you know, when I think about alternatives to the system we have, one major set of things I think about is investing in um, supporting people in ways that are much more evidence based and we
Mhm.
know are much more successful, instead of investing in prison, which we know causes all these problems. So it's very similar to the conversation around defunding the police, right? In that we know that there's huge numbers of seriously mentally ill people in prison, for instance. And we know that people in prison tend to have really low rates of educational achievement, in fact, really high illiteracy rates. And so those are just two examples of ways where, well, those are social safety nets that have failed. And we know it's really expensive to put someone in prison, not to mention in solitary confinement. It costs about $80,000 per person per year to keep someone in solitary confinement in California, as opposed to, say, you know, maybe 30,000 for tuition and room to go to a community college or a California State University. So
Hmm.
I think those cost comparisons are really important, and they speak to how we could allocate resources differently. So to the extent we could provide mental health care in a safe treatment-oriented facility, or we could provide education in an education-oriented facility. I think that's preferable to incarceration, and it tends to be cheaper and have better outcomes. So when I think about alternatives, that's often I think about, well, couldn't we shift the financial investment and the people into other institutions that tend to be less expensive and have better outcomes? And I think another piece I think about, in terms of, I think the another challenge with thinking about abolition is how do we get from here to there? And
Hmm.
um, it's really hard to think about not for instance, people say, well, should we make donations or invest in getting healthcare and protective equipment into prisons now, when it's just kind of enabling a dysfunctional system? And I think that's a perpetual challenge of reform. Are we just enabling a dysfunctional system when we invest in reform? And yet you've got individuals who are literally dying in prison right now because they don't have masks and hand sanitizer. And so
Hmm.
to me, those things are often in tension about, like, how do you save the individuals who are at risk of serious abuse or death right now? And so I think a lot about, that's the other category of interventions I think about, is ways to change the culture in prisons that I think could really affect the, broader um, milieu of how we think about prison, and how people have jobs in tough places that maybe are more workable than they are now. And so when I think about culture in prison, I think about, well, what can we do to invest in prison staff having more resources and being better trained and feeling like they go to work and they're safe and they find their job rewarding and they have good relationships with the folks they're working with inside that institution. And I think that's not so far fetched. I mean, Christian, you and I have talked a lot about Danish prisons and
Hmm.
Scandinavia. And I think that's a place where the thing that struck me the most being in prisons there was that prison staff feel like their jobs are rewarding. They go to work and they feel safe. They feel like they have relationships with the prisoners that are meaningful and they make a difference in people's lives. When you talk to them, they often sound much more like teachers who are happy in the school they're teaching in than
Hmm.
prison staff in the United States who just feel beleaguered by everyone around them. They feel dismissed, even by their communities, right? It's not a very prestigious job. And they feel like they don't have the resources they need to manage really difficult cases. And so that's the other big thing I think about, is how can we create institutions where people love going to work and feel like they're making a difference? Because I think
Right.
that's better for society too.
Hmm.
Yeah, seems like a whole nother world.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, when
Yeah.
we
Go ahead. Go ahead.
when we were our first two episodes, we were learning about Danish prisons, and it just kind of baffled me how different they were compared to the US, like how actually focus on helping prisoners become better people, whereas in the US we mostly focus on punishment. You did
Hmm.
something
Hmm.
bad, you should be punished for it, not you did something bad, well, let's see what we can do to help you not do
Right,
that again you
right,
know
right.
Hmm. Yeah, like that was our first two interviews. It was one was a pre-recorded, oh no, both of them were pre-recorded interviews of just people that thanks to your help, after I got connected to a few people in Denmark, I was able
Mm.
to record a few of their experiences there, and then we went ahead and put it down on the podcast, and people
Oh,
were
that's
able to
cool
learn
too.
from it. Yeah, and people were really excited about it. But well, just stemming off of that on Danish prison policy, because I
Hmm.
actually just got done talking to a Danish inmate, one of the inmates that was featured on the podcast, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I just got done with summer vacation with my kids," and and like that was a normal thing to do.
Yeah.
Right. What does that even mean, right?
But how do you think that we'll be able as a nation to be compatible for that sort of policy and able to actually adopt those practices? Me personally, I feel like that it starts off with first the mindset, because I feel like that since we're an individualistic country, we're fixated on the individual, and that's why we focus on questions of like, well, what if someone murdered someone? Then how
Hmm.
can you let them blah blah? And rather than seeing it as a collectivistic issue, a public health
Hmm.
issue,
Hmm. Hmm.
then we're not able to move forward and actually allow ourselves to imagine a society like that, or at least similar like
Hmm.
that. Like I feel like that we can't adopt everything over there because of there's just too much
Yeah,
here in this
and we're
nation.
our own, right? I mean,
Yeah.
systems are reflections of society, and
Right.
so it is like whatever punishment system we set up, it's going to be different. But yeah,
Right. Right. But what would you do you think that it's possible in order to maybe create something that's similar to that? Like, do you think that we can completely transform over to something like that? Or do you think that we would have to use like years and years and years in order to create something entirely new that fits our, way of life?
that's a really good question. I think that as someone who's traveled to prisons around the world, mostly in Europe and North America, I should say, but I'm I talk to lots of prison researchers who've been all over the world, and my strong sense is that punishment and prisons are more similar than different, right? And so yes, there are vast structural differences between, say, the United States and Scandinavia, or South Africa or Japan, right? I mean, you can like but I think every society has rules, and right, I mean, and every parent has rules and consequences when those rules are broken, and
Mhm.
institutions to put people who can't follow the rules and disrupt society, and so um, I guess absent some truly small societies that function entirely through restorative justice mechanisms, right? But on the scale of society we're talking about, I think there are some fundamentals, and so I actually find that somewhat comforting because it suggests to me that it's not so far fetched to think the United States could do something different and could look to other countries that are more successful. And I think, I think about that in terms of both highlighting all the ways we failed and how costly those failures have been, and kind of that's speaking in particular, I think, to a certain approach to policy making that's very focused on cost benefit analyses, right? And maybe sometimes tends to be a little more politically conservative, but we can, to those folks, we can say, look, we spend billions of dollars on our prisons and we don't get a very good return on our investment. So
Mhm.
can we rethink it from that perspective? And then I think on the flip side, there is the tough moral questions, and um, the 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 really hard debates about do we have a death penalty or not, that also feel intractable, and where people feel like they take really radical positions and there's no in between. But even there too, I think there's a lot of room to say, are there other ways we can think about this, and other alternatives to look to? And there, a place I see is just, I think our system fails to make people feel better, right? On an emotional, if we're talking about it as an individualistic emotional level, I see an increasing amount of engagement with the idea that our adversarial legal system, where a prosecutor takes on the case and seeks the death penalty whether the victim wants it or not, and the victim never understands what happened and never gets to meet the perpetrator, leaves people feeling really hollow. And so I think there's also, on that really individual level, there's also a question of like, well, what could we do that would actually repair the harm of crime in society? And I think there's thinking around that too, right? And so cultural shifts and better treatment, and more acknowledgement of the fact that 95% of people come home, and how can we create environments that make that as maximally socially functional as possible. I think it's easier than people often think to have conversations across the political spectrum, and across sociological frameworks to think about alternatives.
Right.
Yeah, the death penalty always confused me because I'm like, we know that there are a lot of innocent people who end up with the death penalty. So is it worth is it worth those innocent lives to having the death penalty for people that actually quote unquote deserve it? I like it doesn't seem worth it, you know?
Well, and the death penalty is another interesting one. I think that's kind of a magnifying lens on the debates around criminal justice and punishment policy in the US, because um, there's kind of something for everyone there, right? There's the innocence claim if you're kind of individualistic and you're uncomfortable with a system that gets it wrong that often. There's the cost benefit analysis, again, right? The
Hmm.
immense cost of actually executing someone in the United States, and the limited evidence that it has any positive effects in terms of lowering crime rates or being a deterrent. Yeah, so there's all these interesting, and I think many of the debates about the death penalty are really important just for that, for being kind of ways of thinking about, well, how do we grapple with and challenge this system?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, before we even transition over to, asking those questions, the really, really extremely difficult questions and things like that, first we have to, tackle the big issue right now, which is huge inequality, not only within our prison system, but also within, our society, on outside society. So,
Mm,
what would be your advice in order, because it was a comment that you made earlier, with how you said you didn't even know any prisons that are allowing visitation right now, and
mhm,
there's a lot of limitations on just even having a simple phone call.
mhm,
So there's sort of a disconnection and dissonance, and we don't really know what's going on inside. And I feel like that once someone goes into prison, it's sort of alienated, and that's a entirely different world.
mhm,
So how do we make that connection in order to advocate for equal rights, not only in prison, but outside of prison as well? Because I feel like if we do make that sort of correlation with one another, and if
mhm,
we're able to stand up for people that the rest of society deems as, unworthy, then
mhm.
it will be easier and easier to stand up for people who haven't been committed of a crime.
Right.
So I just wanted to know what you thought when it comes to that, when it comes to protesting inside of prison, and then how it could be used to protesting for inmates on the inside, outside. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, here maybe you get my. We had talked about maybe touching on higher education in prison on this call, and so here
right.
this is a kind of
Yeah.
a nice opening for my pitch for the vital importance of that. And this, I mean, this is a little bit of an extension of what I said earlier in terms of thinking about um, one way to think about alternatives to incarceration is to think about other institutions that serve the needs that weren't met that landed people in prison in the first place, other institutions that serve those better. And I think one of the most important of those is education. And I think it is a place where I feel really hopeful in the United States about equalizing and reform. And I mean, it sounds idealistic, and I'm an educator, and but I think there has been a movement over the last few years in the United States to reinvest in higher education for people who are incarcerated, and it's been especially robust in California. And it is a place where I feel the most hope, even now with the pandemic, because these programs that are in existence are figuring out how to continue to get prisoners educational materials. They're doing the same things universities are doing, figuring out how they can give lectures over closed TV networks, right? And instead of in person. And so it's not ideal, but nothing of what people is doing is ideal. And I think that, to me, um, education in prison has multiple benefits that have the potential to break down a lot of the barriers we've talked about. From a kind of reform versus abolition perspective, you're shifting the resources outside of the prison, right? You're investing in educators to provide resources to people who are incarcerated, and so it's got a kind of structural benefit to it. But then it has the benefit of making our prison walls more transparent and porous, right? If one
Hmm.
of the big problems with our prisons is that they're so hidden and opaque, and we don't know enough about what's going on inside of them. The more educators you bring into our prisons, the more you're just creating porousness in those walls that creates kind of incidental oversight and connections, and it keeps people from imagining that our prisons are somehow actually separable from the rest of our society. And I think, just on an individual level, I've been involved in prison education programs in Massachusetts, in New York, and California, and everyone I know who has ever taught a class in prison has changed their perspective on the prison system in the United States. They meet individual students who are incredible, often, in my experience and in others' experiences, some of the best students they've ever interacted with. Um, and that changes, not just, it's not just that they're serving this role of happening to educate people who need education, but they end up really becoming, it's kind of like a Teach for America model, right? They end up becoming advocates for thinking about the system differently because they know so many individuals who they respect so much. And then on the flip side, for people who are incarcerated, I think it does an immense amount to reduce the stigma in our society of incarceration, right? Because no matter, even if we tore down every prison in this country tomorrow, which obviously is sort of hard to imagine, we would still have millions of people in the US with criminal records who had served time in prison who are facing a stigma for that. And I don't see that changing until those folks are professionals in every part of society, just like you and me. And the only way to
Hmm.
do that is to get them excellent educations and not just bachelor's degrees, but put them on pathways to law degrees and medical degrees and um, accounting degrees, right? And things that people just sort of wince
Hmm.
and think of. Formerly incarcerated folks can't do those things. But, you know, if you committed a felony when you were 16 and you served 15 years in prison, and in that time you managed to get a bachelor's degree, maybe you actually would make an amazing lawyer, a much better
Hmm.
lawyer than me, in fact, given your
Hmm.
experiences and your knowledge of the system. And I think we're very slowly starting to see that happening. And I think the pathway to making that happen more and overcoming the stigma and the inequality is opening these educational doors so that people accidentally run into folks who it turns out were incarcerated, and that forces them to kind of change their assumptions about it.
Hmm. Exactly. But I guess the first thing that we would have to do too is to re-examine policy because there's a lot of barriers in order to even work inside specific professions.
Yes.
And it all goes by case basis. Like say for instance, you're in prison for fraud or you're in prison um, for drug addiction, then you're
Hmm.
not able to practice medicine because you're not trusted with certain substances.
Right.
So I feel like that there's a lot of work that needs to be done when it comes to allowing people to have a chance in order to prove themselves and actually um, be, citizens that are amazing at what they do, regardless or in spite of having a criminal record.
Right.
But I have no
Obviously,
idea how to do that. Yeah,
not
so
everyone can do everything, right?
right,
Like, I
right.
think I'd make a horrible doctor. I didn't go to medical school.
Hmm.
And similarly, some people might have aspects of their criminal background that would suggest that perhaps they'd have fewer mountains to climb in a
Hmm.
different profession, right? But right, I think it's opening those doors, ha- put putting more options on the table for more people.
Right.
And I really, I mean, it's why, one of the things I'm working on now is establishing a bachelor's degree in prison, that will be offered by the University of California. And I think that's, to me, it gets at a lot of these goals in really
Hmm.
important ways. It involves, I think it's absolutely vital to have public education involved in these kinds of initiatives. A lot of the really great prison programs around the country are run by small liberal arts colleges, and that's great, but it's really hard to scale up. And so
Right.
thinking about how we integrate incarcerated folks into our public education systems, to me, is really really important. And then it's, it goes both ways, right? Christian, on the one hand, we have to think about how to remove the structural barriers that exist, and on the other hand, if you get enough people who are really amazing um, standing in front of licensing boards and saying, what about me, I think
Hmm.
that's a really powerful way to start to move the needle on removing some of those barriers, right? Because once you grant a handful of exceptions, then it
Right.
becomes easier to change the policy. So you
Hmm.
got to work from both directions, I think.
Yeah. Well, how about you expand a little bit more on your own project when it comes to providing a BA? Because I, for one of my careers, I was working at a community college here in the Inland Empire, and I was doing a lot of research on what were the educational opportunities after you released from prison. And I only saw one institution that helped with, obtaining a bachelor's degree while you're behind bars. So I was really excited when you told me that the UC system is also considering on doing this and
Mhm.
providing an initiative in order for a BA to be earned. So what's been going on with that?
It's really exciting. It's been a thing that's given me a lot of hope these days. Is that, and California is just a wonderful place to be doing it, because about 5 years ago, the state invested in funding the community colleges to offer associate's degrees in prison. So,
Hmm.
whereas in the early 2000s, when I was teaching in prison while I was in graduate school at San Quentin, I was teaching in one of the only associate's degree programs in California. And now every prison in the state has an associate's degree program. So it was really just an incredible investment by the state in shifting the infrastructure to incorporate prisoners in the higher education system. However, there's only one bachelor's program right now in the state. It's run by Cal State Lancaster, and they've done amazing work building an initial program. But my hope is that we can get every state prison to have
Hmm.
either a Cal State or a UC or both on site offering degrees, and giving folks, a bridge if and when they are released, giving them a landing pad by transferring onto campus. And so we're in the early stages of, just like Cal State LA has built the first Cal State model. We at UC Irvine, which is, there's just support across the campus because UCI is one of the younger UCs and one that really prides itself on being both inventive and really supportive of diverse student populations. So UCI is known for being a Hispanic serving institution, an Asian American serving institution, and for having a really robust center to support first generation college students and students who've been systems impacted, whether as veterans or foster care. And so UCI is just so proud of those initiatives and being a leader in the UC. And this idea of being the first to offer a BA in prison, I think really fits with the kind of institutional sort of self vision to put it one way. So yeah, I think it's so the idea is that UCI will partner with a local community college in a prison in San Diego and kind of offer a pilot program, matriculate students who would have already earned an associate's degree in a community college and the California higher education system is just beautifully structured so that if you take the right set of courses in community college and get a 3.5 GPA or higher, you're automatically admissible to certain programs in certain kind of sister Cal States and UCs. And so the idea is we take a cohort of incarcerated students who've completed an associate's degree in a program that's already automatically transferable to UCI, and then we'll do the last 2 years of coursework to get them a bachelor's degree. So we're kind of leveraging basically existing infrastructure in a really beautiful higher education system in the state of California to incorporate prisoners and kind of building on what the state has been trying to do over the last few years. And so the idea is we do that with one group of students, and then we kind of create a model of how we could do it with other. It would be a sociology degree first, because that's what the students are getting from the community college,
Hmm. Hmm.
but that we leverage on that to offer other degrees and to help other UCs offer similar programs in state prisons that are close to them.
Hmm. That's awesome. I know that one of the sort of patterns that I noticed during my own time looking at what associate degrees
Hmm.
was offered during while you were serving your time
Hmm.
was, yes, it was under sociology and then it was under communications. However, I didn't see any like under like the hard sciences or like mathematics or anything under STEM.
Hmm.
Do you think that that would be sort of a possibility later on?
That is absolutely one of our goals. We have one of the core faculty leading this initiative is a bio-sci professor,
Oh,
and
nice.
so he keeps us honest. He's always asking, "How are we going to get the sciences in? How are we going to support them?"
Yeah, that's
And
great.
I think to try to wrap up towards a happy note, I think it is a silver lining of the pandemic and all of this forced move into remote or online education is that I think all educators everywhere are having to think about how do we offer learning models that we always thought had to be in person in a classroom in alternative ways. And I think that will be a huge asset for incarcerated students to be able to take those models and also bring them into prisons.
That's wonderful. It really is.
So how would they pay for this? Would this be publicly funded or
Well, this is another getting in the weeds, another beauty of using public education systems. It turns out that the UCs have a really wonderful program that's like Pell Grants. So
Mm.
prisoners have very limited access to Pell Grants since the 1990s, and that's one of the reasons why there's not enough. Why there's so little higher education in prisons right now, but the UCs have a program that's more robust than Pell, that's designed to make sure, basically people who are slightly broader income, right? I think it's families earning less than 80,000, so it's encompasses more people than Pell, which has a lower income bar. But the idea also is that if for any reason you're not Pell eligible, so for instance, dreamers might not be Pell eligible, other groups you can imagine for some reason aren't, that they are also incorporated in this tuition program that already exists in the UCs. That's basically designed to make sure students from a variety of family backgrounds and socioeconomic statuses can get a elite education at a UC. And so the idea is that this would fund tuition for this program also, that students in prison, especially given all the infrastructure in the state that's being set up with the community college pathways, that most of the folks in prison should be eligible for that program in the UCs. And so that's a really exciting piece of it also, that again, in a state that's invested so heavily in higher education and in supporting a broad range of backgrounds of students getting a higher education, there's a lot of infrastructure to draw on to just extend what's there to
Mhm.
incarcerated students.
Well, yeah, that's wow, that's amazing. It's so inspiring to hear that higher education is finally doing something to get more involved, because
Right.
I was like, okay, I see plenty of representation for the community college level. However, the way that our society is set up, you need at least a bachelor's degree, or you need at least a
Yep.
master's degree in order to actually make not only a good income, but even just a substantial income now.
Yep.
So it's initiatives like that that's just really inspiring and just necessary
I'm
in
glad.
general.
I
Yeah.
spent so many years studying solitary confinement. I had to find something to talk about that was less depressing at the dinner
Right.
table.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we could pivot from the worst of prisons to the potentially best of it in this conversation.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Well, I do believe that we did hit the 1 hour mark already. I'd hate to keep you any longer if your toddler is still
I
asleep or
He probably will wake up soon, so
okay.
I feel like we should wrap up while there's still peace in the household.
Okay. Perfect. Sounds good.
Before we conclude this episode, I'd like to take a moment to read one of Dr. Keramet Reiter's excerpts she wrote for a blog called Campaign for the American Reader about her book 23/7 Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement. In an effort to understand who had made prison building decisions in California in the 1980s, when the state built one of the first modern supermax prisons with 1,056 beds designed for indefinite solitary confinement, I interviewed prison officials who had worked on prison design, construction, and operational policy in those days. One of the people I interviewed was Craig Brown, who had been the head of the California prison system in the 1980s. When I asked him what role and legislature played in prison building decisions in the state in the 1980s, he said, as I quote on page 99, "You're not going to find much in the record. It was all negotiated, off record, and we corrections pretty much had our way with the legislature." Indeed, the only legislative mention I ever found of California's Supermax prison, later named Pelican Bay State Prison, was a transcript of a conference committee meeting in which legislatures joked about whether the new prison being built in Del Norte County, on California's northernmost border with Oregon, on the coastline, should be named Dungeness Dungeon or Slammer by the Sea. While a legislature argued over what to call it, prison officials, supported by Craig Brown's behind closed doors legislative negotiations, designed one of the most secure and most expensive prison facilities ever built in the United States. Prisoners at Pelican Bay would spend 23 or more hours of every day, 7 days a week, in windowless cells barely the size of wheelchair accessible bathroom stalls. Prison officials decided which prisoners got sent there and for how long. Over the last 3 decades, hundreds of prisoners have been sent to Pelican Bay because prison officials labeled them, or validated them in prison policy language, as gang members, based on their tattoos, what they were reading, or who they were hanging out with on prison yards. More than 500 of these prisoners spent at least 10 years in a total solitary confinement at Pelican Bay, never seeing the moon, feeling grass under their feet, or shaking a loved one's hand. I wanted to leave you with that to think about because it's important to understand just how shocking and awful prisons are in the United States. We're lucky to have people like Dr. Reiter fighting for prison reform. There's a quote by Fyodor Dostoevsky that summarizes this well. A society should be judged not by how it treats its outstanding citizens, but by how it treats its criminals. If you're interested in learning more about solitary confinement, we definitely recommend checking out Dr. Reiter's book, 23/7 Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement. And as always, we'll see you next time on Our Small Majority.